45 days? That is what separates Canada from the most consequential trade deadline in its modern history. On July 1st, 2026, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the framework that governs more than $550 billion of Canadian exports to the United States every single year, faces its first mandatory joint review. If the parties confirm renewal, Canada gets 16 more years of relative stability. If any one country declines, the agreement shifts into annual reviews, and the clock starts counting down to a hard expiration in 2036. Formal bilateral talks between Canada and the United States began in May 2026, 6 weeks before the deadline. This is where Canada actually stands, and what Carney is actually holding. To understand the stakes, you need to understand what Article 34.7 of the CUSMA actually says, and why the mechanism matters more than the headline. The agreement, which entered into force on July 1, 2020, replaced NAFTA with a built-in sunset clause. Every 6 years, all three governments must meet and confirm in writing whether they wish to continue. A unanimous confirmation extends the deal for 16 years. A single country's refusal to confirm does not immediately end the agreement, but it triggers a 10-year countdown of annual reviews, at the end of which the deal expires permanently on July 1, 2036. Think of it like this. Canada has had a long-term lease on secure access to the American market, the largest, wealthiest consumer economy on Earth. That lease comes up for renewal on July 1st. The landlord is signaling he wants different terms, and the lease agent, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, told Congress in December 2025 that a rubber stamp renewal is, in his words, not in the national interest. That statement was reported as a negotiating position. It is not. It is a declaration that the United States intends to use this review as a forced renegotiation. Every concession Canada has resisted since February 2025, on dairy, on automotive rules of origin, on aligning trade policy with Washington's stance toward China, is now back on the table with a deadline attached. For Canada, the CUSMA is not just a trade agreement, it is a legal shield. When Trump imposed sweeping emergency tariffs on Canadian goods under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, CUSMA-compliant exports were exempted. That exemption covers more than 90% of what Canada sells to the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States struck down the IEEPA tariff mechanism in early 2026, ruling that emergency powers law does not grant the president explicit authority to impose tariffs. Trump responded with a new 10% global tariff, but the CUSMA exemption structure remains the primary protection for Canadian exporters. Lose that protection through expiration or through a renegotiation that strips key exemptions, and the Canadian economy faces a tariff exposure it has not experienced since before NAFTA. Here is where it gets really interesting. Carney did not enter the CUSMA review as a supplicant. He entered it having already absorbed a year of tariff pressure, having watched 22 Canadian lumber mills close, having overseen a federal budget that set a target of doubling non-U.S. exports by 2035, and having won a federal election in April 2026 on the explicit promise of standing up to Washington. That electoral mandate matters. It is the reason Carney told reporters in May 2026 that Canada would not use energy or critical minerals as deliberate bargaining chips, not because Canada lacks leverage, but because he read Greer's warning against it as a signal that Washington already knows those are Canada's strongest cards. When Carney met Trump at the White House on May 6, 2026, the first face-to-face meeting between the two leaders at the lowest point in bilateral relations in decades, he did not lead with lumber. He led with defense. He committed to a step change in Canadian military investment. 2% of GDP by March 2026, 5% by 2035. He directed Canada's Department of National Defence to engage on Trump's Golden Dome missile defense initiative. Canada removed all restrictions on air and missile defense cooperation. The lumber file stayed open. The dairy file stayed open. The China alignment question, Washington's demand that Canada adopt a common external tariff posture toward Beijing stayed open. Carney's calculation was explicit: give Trump a win on defense, protect the core economic files for the formal CUSMA review. But here's the problem. The timeline is now extraordinarily compressed. Formal Canada-US bilateral talks began in May 2026, after Trump canceled all negotiations in October 2025 over an Ontario provincial government television advertisement that criticized his tariffs. The talks that did resume were the first face-to-face contact between the two sides since that cancellation. Janice Charette, Canada's newly appointed chief trade negotiator, met Greer in Washington in March 2026, but formal bilateral negotiations, the kind that actually moved text, only began in May. Meanwhile, Mexico had already opened its own bilateral talks with the United States in March, was working through 52 specific American demands, and had been identified by multiple analysts as Washington's preferred negotiating partner going into the review. Investment bank Jefferies assessed the probability of a clean 16-year renewal by July 1st at 10%, 90% probability that the deadline passes without a full extension. Oxford Economics modeled the worst-case scenario, which they assigned a 10% occurrence probability, as one in which CUSMA exemptions are stripped, effective tariff rates on Canadian goods rise sharply, and trade policy uncertainty becomes permanently elevated from Q3 2026 onward. Canada's chief trade negotiator herself acknowledged publicly that the review would likely not conclude by the July 1st deadline. There is another angle that almost nobody is talking about. Canada has more leverage than it appears, and the evidence is the list of things Washington has not done. It has not triggered CUSMA withdrawal. It has not stripped the tariff exemptions protecting 90% of Canadian exports. It has not imposed the 100% tariff Trump threatened if Canada traded with China. Each action was available. None happened. According to the CFR analysis from May 2026, the reason is straightforward. The United States economy is also inside the CUSMA framework, and pulling it apart carries costs American industry has lobbied hard to avoid. 69 U.S. business associations wrote to Greer in March 2026 urging a 16-year extension, calling the agreement critical to American competitiveness. When Canada's lumber tariffs closed 22 mills and tightened North American softwood supply, American homebuilders paid the price in construction costs. The feedback loop runs both ways. Canada's pain becomes America's problem, and that gives Carney something real to negotiate with. The other lever is resource endowment. Canada holds the world's third-largest oil reserves and significant deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and uranium, the minerals underpinning both the clean energy transition and advanced defense manufacturing. When Greer warned Canada against weaponizing energy and critical minerals, Carney's response was deliberate. Canada would not threaten. He did not say those sectors carry no weight. A country that controls resources the other party needs does not have to make demands. It simply has to hold its position. CSIS published 6 CUSMA outcome scenarios, ranging from full renewal to complete collapse. The highest probability scenario was neither extreme. A prolonged negotiation in which July 1st passes without confirmation, annual reviews begin, and both countries spend several years resolving what 6 weeks could not. For Canada, that is not a victory, but it is not collapse. Carney has signaled consistently that he is prepared for exactly that sustained uncertainty, because a deal forced through in 6 weeks under maximum pressure is one Canada would spend 16 years regretting. Now here is where this starts affecting people who are not following the trade file closely. If you work in Canadian manufacturing, in Windsor, in Hamilton, in Sarnia, in Guelph, the CUSMA review is not an abstract diplomatic event. It is the legal environment that determines whether the plant you work in can sign long-term supplier contracts with American partners. Annual review uncertainty does not just affect policy people. It affects investment decisions, hiring cycles, and the willingness of American companies to source from Canadian suppliers when they cannot guarantee their own regulatory environment 12 months from now. If you export from Canada, agricultural products, aluminum, processed goods, professional services, your access to the American market depends on a tariff exemption structure that is, right now, being renegotiated by people in rooms that are not open to the public. The Bank of Canada estimated in early 2026 that the full tariff regime had already put Canadian GDP on a path approximately 1.5% lower than it would have been without the trade disruption. That is a structural drag, not a recessionary shock, but it compounds. Every quarter of uncertainty is a quarter in which investment decisions get deferred, hiring gets paused, and the economy grows more slowly than it otherwise would. What Carney is trying to do, and what his advisors at the Department of Finance and Global Affairs Canada have been saying publicly, is buy time without making premature concessions. The argument is that a deal negotiated under maximum pressure in 6 weeks will be worse for Canada than a deal negotiated over 18 months with more information, more political space on both sides, and potentially a more favorable U.S. political environment after the November 2026 midterm elections. That argument is coherent. Whether it is correct depends entirely on whether Trump uses the annual review mechanism as genuine leverage or as a pretext for a longer-term decoupling that Canada cannot control. So here is the question. Mark Carney walked into the most important trade negotiation in Canada's modern history with 6 weeks on the clock, a defense commitment in his pocket, and 3 core economic files still open. He has not conceded on lumber. He has not conceded on dairy. He has not agreed to align Canada's China policy with Washington's. He has instead told Canadians that the way through this is patience, strategic clarity, and the knowledge that Canada's resources, Canada's geography, and Canada's role in American supply chains give it more weight at this table than the timeline suggests. Some will argue that Carney is reading this correctly, that a deal done badly in 6 weeks is worse than annual review uncertainty, that Canada's leverage is real and growing, and that Trump will eventually need what Canada has. Others will argue that 5,600 lumber workers, 22 closed mills, and a GDP running 1.5% below potential are not abstract statistics. They are the cost of a strategy that has not yet produced a single tariff reduction, and that the people paying that cost deserve a faster answer than be patient. Both arguments are honest. Which one is right may depend on what happens on July 1st. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to understand what this same deadline looks like from the American side, what American factory workers and home buyers have at stake, that full breakdown is on our partner channel, North Decoded.